By noon, we climbed a hill to find a house with several sick Japanese. As I walked to the door, one of my men behind me cut loose with a bar, shooting from the hip. He barely missed cutting me in half. I found swear words I hardly ever used. It was the first time I ever swore directly at a soldier. Stopping on a hill to rest, we had a view of perhaps 2.5 miles in nearly every direction. There, across a river, a bit over 1,000 yards away, was a Japanese peeling a coconut with a machete. He was so small, so far away. My scope rifle was zeroed for 300 yards, but a bullet at 1,000 yards drops about 16 feet. I had shot on the Camp Perry range many times at 1,000 yards. Lazily, I put the gun across my knees, judging the drop, not actually intending to shoot. Someone said disgustedly, "Hell, you're not going to shoot, are you? It's just a waste." His remark burned me, so I shot. Nearly 2 seconds later, the Japanese dropped. What none of us knew was that there were about 30 more enemies around him in defilade that we couldn't see. They panicked, running as a close-knit group up a far hill. Everyone cut loose then, aiming high. Amazingly, they knocked down one more of the enemy. That's musketry fire for you, concentrating fire on one point, effective. We bivouacked for the night, pushing on the next morning, carrying our wounded man. Climbing to the top of a ridge, Bredding and I had a cigarette while the patrol rested. About 100 yards across from us was a sheer cliff paralleling our ridge. The valley to our left and right was narrow with short grass. Far to the right, we heard a Nambu machine gun firing, a far different sound from our .30 caliber. Eventually, I saw a single file of men headed toward us, perhaps 800 yards away. Breeding said, "That must be Peterson's squad. We must have caught up with some of our outfit." I looked through the scope. Like heck it is. There are 10 Japanese going to be just below us within minutes. When they pass by us, I'll take the front end. You start at the rear. I let the lead Japanese pass me about 30 yards, then cut loose. These Japanese weren't dummies. They were experienced, spaced about 15 yards apart. When the first man was down, the second turned to face me. The third hit the deck, as did the fourth. There was no place to hide. To my right, below, a Japanese grenade went off. I figured the man committed kamikaze. As the first shot was fired, my men below me boiled over the hill. It was all over in seconds. By noon, we approached the Ormoc Road, just in time to meet Lieutenant Colonel G, who had come along in an armoured car. He said, "I'll take your man to Ormoc. There is supposed to be a field hospital setting up there. We'll have to tie the litter on the back of the vehicle, for there's no room inside." We found later that there were 2 surgeons in Ormoc, but their hospital equipment had not arrived. Using razor blades for scalpels, they worked on our man. He lived. Just past the Ormoc Road, we met the remainder of Easy and bivouacked together for the night. When morning came, I noticed a tall dead tree loaded with monkeys on the top branches. Did they do this for safety, or did misery love company? Many men in rear areas bought monkeys from the natives. They might look and act cute, but they couldn't be housebroken. That morning, one of my platoons got into a firefight on a hill. Although a company, we split up and spread out for small, individual operations. They lost a man. Some minutes later, one of our L4 Cubs flew over. The pilot dropped a red smoke grenade on top of the hill, indicating dug-in Japanese. We already knew that. Up to this period of 2 to 3 days of travel across country, our score for the entire company totaled 182 enemy killed, with a loss of 2 men and 1 man wounded. I received a radio call from a company near Ormoc. They said, "Chuck, you should see all the decorative pom-poms sticking out of the ground over here, the kind of tassels you wear on your winter caps in Dakota." I asked, "What about them?" They replied, "You're supposed to pull them out of the ground. Trouble is, they're tied to a stick grenade. We dug up a couple to check. Just thought you should know." We found enemy soldiers dying of disease and starvation, so we helped them along. As I lowered myself through bushes to a riverbed, a man behind me tapped me on the shoulder. He pointed. Across the wash was a Japanese soldier sound asleep, his body covered with a piece of canvas. I looked down at him as he softly snored, totally unconscious of the noise a shot makes. Immediately his group, who were nearby, hit the jungle en masse. We heard them scramble. Climbing another ridge, we saw Company G assaulting a hill on a ridge far to our left. We could see the Japanese standing upright, tossing grenades down upon Company G's men. I called their CO, telling him the circumstances. I advised him to warn his men that we would provide overhead fire to pin down the Japanese for his attack. One of our bipod machine guns opened up at about 1,500 yards across the target, pinning down the enemy. The Company G men had been warned that we were firing. They paid no attention to the snapping bullets. At the last moment we ceased firing, and they took the hill. Someone called on the radio, thanking me. An hour later we ran into another hot potato. Johnny Divers, a Company H machine gunner and an experienced man, decided to take the point of one of our platoons. There was a single shot fired to my right, above Fedji and me. We tried to penetrate the bush towards the shot, but at that instant someone at the head of our patrol began firing steadily. We hurried to Malcolm Walsh, who had killed nearly 20 Japanese soldiers who thought they were surrounded in a box canyon. One enemy had laid back on a huge boulder and committed kamikaze with a grenade. Walsh was not excited. He was the coolest man I ever saw. I made sure he got a medal for his exceptional courage. We went in the back way for Divers, to find him dead. A Japanese soldier had searched him. As I knew, he wore a jade stone on a chain around his neck. It was gone. A tremendous boulder stood about 100 feet to the east of us. Someone thought he saw a quick movement behind it. Edging around each side of the giant rock, the men got another enemy soldier. Sergeant Fedji went back to check the Japanese that Walsh had shot, only to find another Japanese soldier robbing their bodies. He shot the man. Fedji recovered some excellent maps, all indicating a defensive position the enemy was preparing up north, the direction we were headed. Complete instructions were included on the maps, so simple that even we could fathom them. We climbed farther up the mountain and reached a narrow path curving around a steep grassy hill on our right. The left side of the 6-foot-wide trail ended in a sheer drop of at least 300 feet. I was the third man in the patrol, suddenly aware of a noise above me. A Japanese soldier had spotted our patrol and, trapped, climbed above us. He was clinging to grass roots above, hoping for safety until our patrol passed by. It was my luck that he slid down onto me. The roots he was holding had pulled loose. We both had our rifles on our shoulders. As I grasped at his chest with my left hand, he hit me in the face with his fist, knocking off my glasses. I dared not step back, and no one could help me. My runner, Kegel, the fourth man in line, was yelling, "Kill him! Kill him! Kill him!" Lordy, I didn't have to be told. Fortunately, I was able to thrust him back against the almost vertical bank and managed to retrieve my knife with my right hand. Believe me, a good knife should never be used to open ration cans. It dulls the edge. I felt a sudden relief. It had been close. Things settled down, and we got off the trail just around a long bend. In a valley ahead was a nipper hut. It had an open window, and with cover fire I snuck ahead to toss in a grenade. My toss was lousy. The grenade missed the window and bounced back toward me. I turned back and hit the dirt. It proved that our US hand grenades were nearly worthless. No one was even scratched. Inside the house, I gathered a .25 Colt automatic, a Nambu 7.65 pistol, and best of all, a fine camera with 3 spare rolls of 120 film. I gave the guns away. Before dark, we bivouacked on a ridge overlooking the so-called town of Abidjao, along the ocean beach. It was no town now, having only one house left. To our north, about 800 yards away, a bit above us in elevation, a Japanese soldier stood upright. He was about to direct mortar fire upon us. His first round struck far to our left. In seconds, one of our 60 mm mortars hastily set up and dropped a round exactly on top of him. He had turned and was bent over to run when the shell exploded within a few feet of him. I marvelled at the skill of our mortarmen. A perfect bullseye. There was no more mortar fire on us that evening. About 11 p.m. we were subjected to repeated Nambu machine gun fire. Bullets ricocheted everywhere. Luckily, no one was hit. That brought to mind another vital rule. Always move your position after dark when exposed in open country. When possible, we did this, sending out a scouting party just before dark to locate a safe bivouac. We lucked out this night. The next morning, I sent out Lieutenants Ross and Sherar with their platoons in different directions to scout around before we descended from the mountain down to Abijao. Lieutenant Pete Sherar successfully ambushed more Japanese, while Lieutenant Charles Ross ran into trouble, encountering a Japanese group. A rifle bullet hit one of the M1 clips in Ross's cartridge belt. As I remember, a few remaining bullets in the clip caught fire. Pieces of the slug penetrated his abdomen. His men carried him back to us. After recovering Sherar's patrol, we headed downhill. Charles was evacuated by boat at Abijao. I would sure miss him. He was tops. He was evacuated to New Guinea, but returned to Easy about 2 months later. This is Charles Ross's story. Our platoon moved single file because of the thick vegetation. I followed the lead scout, with a barman just behind me. Suddenly we saw the enemy on the trail about 30-40 yards ahead. Without stopping, the bar gunner and I moved up to the lead scout and, walking forward, began firing. I fired 3 clips of 8 rounds each from my M1 before being shot in the hip and knocked down. My left leg was paralyzed, and I could not get up or even crawl. In a few seconds, my platoon medic, Teague, was there examining my wound. My platoon sergeant, Jeffrey, knelt beside me, the enemy still firing steadily at us. My lead squad quickly set up a base of fire to cover us. I told Jeffrey, "You're in command now." He said, "We're pulling back." Under the circumstances, it was the proper thing to do, as we were only to scout out a short distance. Jeffrey withdrew the platoon without any other casualties. As I was carried back, bullets were cracking all around us. We arrived back at our rendezvous point on time. Down at the beach, we found our Easy Company kitchen gear had been transported to Abijao by LCM and was to feed the entire battalion as they arrived. That evening, our regimental commander, Colonel Mahoney, and Captain Williams visited Abijao. Williams, a former company commander of the 164th Infantry, was to be rotated home and had come to say goodbye to us all. He and Colonel Mahoney slept in the house at the north edge of the camp. At dawn, I awoke to Nambu machine gun fire from the north beach. Sergeant Fedje was already up. He hit the hole we had dug in the sand just a second after a bullet struck a kitchen range and then ricocheted exactly where he would have dropped. I kidded him. "Darn good thing you were slow, or you would have had it." I dug the bullet out of the sand, then dropped it. It was hot. Sadly enough, the Japanese had shot up the house, killing Williams. No one else was even scratched. After eating a noon meal at the Easy Kitchen, we drew rations and replenished our ammunition, moving a short distance farther north. From there we climbed east, up to the first mountain ridge to set up a defensive zone to protect Abijao from further shooting from the north. While digging in, I observed several enemy enter a clearing far above and south of Abijao. I reported it as an artillery target, but was informed we had no artillery as yet. Evidently, Company H mortars were not available. Nothing was done about this group of at least 40 to 50 Japanese. They stopped to rest high above Abijao, only a mile and a half away. On our south flank, a narrow ravine led down to the ocean. It was the gully the Japanese had used when they shot up the camp that morning. We dug firing holes to plug the trail and around our company perimeter. It had just turned dark when Lieutenant Roche was bitten by a poisonous centipede. He was given morphine to reduce the pain as the terrain was too rough to move him down to Abijao after dark. About midnight, I heard a bar firing down in the ravine. There were 2 or 3 grenades thrown. All was quiet, so 2 of us checked. We found our bar man dead. He had opened fire with his weapon instead of throwing a grenade as the Japanese patrol came down the ravine. They were evidently going to repeat their performance of that past morning. One Japanese was lucky. His grenade had landed in our man's dug position. From then on, we booby-trapped all approaches. Our battalion commander, Mac, showed up the next morning, telling me to send out a patrol higher up the mountain to the east. Each hill in this area was covered with trees and brush. The small, narrow valleys had short grass. We were in the midst of General Suzuki's gathering area of several thousand Japanese. We got into a hot argument. I told him it was stupid to even think of sending out a small patrol where every hill was loaded with Japanese with weapons covering the draws. I told him, "We'll lose men without gaining a thing." Mac was adamant. "Mahoney, the regimental commander, has ordered me to patrol that area. You are damn well going to do it." I had bad feelings about this. The Japanese were more than plentiful. They had their backs against the wall, and this was their selected rendezvous area. It was Lieutenant Pete Sherrard's turn for the patrol with 3rd Platoon. I advised him, "Don't go a darn bit farther than you have to. I'm not telling you to dog it, just play it safe. Abijao is inside the Japanese defensive boundary shown on those maps we captured." He nodded. "I'll try to stay under cover, but there are open spots. We'll give it a shot." Twice that afternoon we heard heavy firing. Finally the patrol returned, just as we were preparing to go to their aid. Sherrard had caught a machine gun burst in his knee. His platoon sergeant was shot through the hip. At least 5 or more men suffered wounds from the rifle and Nambu fire. One man approached me, saying, "Look, Captain, I'm the luckiest man in the world. I've been shot through both ears, one on the way out on the patrol, the other while returning." True. A bullet had grazed his right cheek from his eye back through his ear. The opposite ear had a clean hole just above the lobe. I was told later that Sherrard refused all medical aid until each of his men was cared for. Another exceptional officer I was mighty sorry to lose. He was moved to the States. I made sure Mac was informed about this stupid patrol he had insisted upon. He turned away, giving me a scornful look. 2 days later, we went downhill to the beach, moving about 2 miles north before again climbing into the mountains. One of our companies had been attempting to take a major hill that overlooked an internal valley of about 4 square miles. They had not succeeded. I had lost my executive officer, Mork, earlier, and, after also losing Ross, Rausch and Sherrard, was now down to Clemens. I was glad to get a replacement officer to help fill our ranks, Lieutenant Baranowski. Luckily, we finally had supporting mortar fire, also 105 mm backup from the 245th Field Artillery. Lieutenant Clemens suggested, "Charlie, I believe we can take that hill after dark by shelling it with our 81mm mortars." "You think they'll back off the hill, then come back up after the firing?" He grinned. "Wouldn't you?" I would, and he would. When daylight came, his platoon was dug well into the holes created by the delay mortar shells we had dropped. He had a warm reception for the Japanese coming back up the hill at first light. I moved the balance of the company up, and we began improving the mortar holes. There was another lower hill 200 yards east of us, another 300 yards west of us, and one straight ahead, all occupied by Japanese. From our advantageous height, we could see Japanese everywhere, singles and groups. After all, there were thousands of enemies in these few square miles of the Abijao area. Our 245th Field Artillery Observer had a field day, as did our 81mm mortar fire director. Our hill was critical. The enemy had to retake it. They were being slaughtered by our artillery and mortars. Just at dusk, we received machine gun fire from both sides and the front. Below the nose of our hill, a large group of enemy attacked. We held. They hit us 3 times that night, causing us severe losses. When daylight came, I had 6 men dead and a score wounded. We handed out plenty of punishment too. What we would have given for parachute flares that night. Sergeant Fedji and I occupied a mortar-created hole about 20 feet from the north edge of the hill. The heaviest attack occurred at the east nose. One of the artillerymen was plastered with grenade fragments and crawled to our hole. A second man, Barnes, arrived, saying, "I can't feel my leg." I ran my hand down his left leg to find heavy damage to his calf. Farther down, his ankle was gone, the 2 straps of his boot still holding his foot in place. I put my belt just below his knee for a tourniquet, knowing he had already lost a lot of blood. As Joel began to unwrap a unit of plasma, I shot Barnes with a half tube of morphine. The plasma kits were complicated, especially when working in total darkness. There was a blood plasma unit, plus a can of distilled water and hoses. The liquids had to be mixed. Covering up the best we could with ponchos, using a Zippo for light, we finally got a unit prepared. All this time there was heavy firing and grenades were exploding. At that instant a man panicked, breaking from the north edge of the hill, running across the perimeter. Someone shot him. A call came from a medic. "Anyone got a unit of plasma?" Our man with the damaged leg said, "Give it to him. You can fix one for me in the morning." A small diversion came from the north. I heard a grenade land a few feet from me. I ducked my head but didn't pull in my arms. Several pieces of rock penetrated the skin of my forearms. I had stupidly left my sleeves rolled up. I dug the pieces out when daylight came, no sweat. With the dawn came the quiet. We mixed another unit of blood, but I was unable to locate a vein in either of our wounded man's arms. He had lost so much blood. I did what I had been told, inserted the long needle into his buttocks, a slow process to move plasma. At that moment, a Piper L4 flew very near us. The pilot or passenger was firing a Colt .45 down between our hill and the adjoining one to our left. The pilot raised us on our artillery forward observer's radio. "There is a large group of Japanese just below your hill. They're running east now." A carrying party took away our casualties and wounded while our artillery and mortars resumed punishing the Japanese. I realized this was no cinch. They were hurting. They were desperate to retake this hill. That afternoon, the 2nd Battalion Reconnaissance Unit, under Lieutenant Bui, attempted to take the hill to our south. One Japanese came charging around the hill toward Bui, who was crouched in low brush. His Arisaka rifle with bayonet seemed much too long for him. His shrill voice came clearly. "Banzai! Banzai!" He was mowed down by men from our hill. Bai was engaged in a hand grenade duel with the Japanese just ahead of him. Unfortunately, a Japanese grenade fragment entered his eye, forcing him to pull back. Twice that day, we watched the enemy carrying mortar shells across country from the north, delivering them behind the hill just to our front. They hit us twice again that night. We held with fewer losses. When daylight came, I heard a deep thunk. I knew it was their mortar firing. The first shell went over, exploding just to our rear. Knowing the havoc a mortar could create, I ran over the forward slope of the hill, well past our perimeter line, to locate the mortar by sound. The next round landed in the rocks, 25 feet in front of me. Thankfully, it was a dud. Rock particles spewed from it. Turning, I ran back into the perimeter, only to get whacked in the rear. It was like being hit by a heavy plank. I had passed those pull-type igniters out too freely, without warning the men to pull in their booby traps at daybreak. The grenade had exploded 3 feet from my rear end. As I lay flat on my stomach, momentarily stunned, 2 men lifted my jacket and slid down my pants. They were grinning. "Geez, Cap, you're a lucky one." Those first 2 nights, we threw at least 300+ grenades. Many just popped, breaking in half. We knew the contractors who had made them had cheated. Most had only a teaspoon of EC blank powder inside. It was reported many times, but nothing was done. Give me a Mills or Japanese grenade any day. Evidently, 2 mortar rounds were all they had that were serviceable, and 1 had failed to detonate. We lucked out again. No more rounds were fired. Since Lieutenant Paul Clemens had been through much in Bougainville while with Easy Company, I had the utmost confidence in him. Both of us were of the same opinion. We had too many men on this hill. If the Japanese acquired more mortar shells, we might have to evacuate. Our losses indicated it was time we took the hill to the north and eliminated that aggravation. I was sick and tired of the enemy there taking shots at us every time we popped up our heads. But even with heavy covering fire from our hill, we knew the attack might be costly. The enemy was well dug in. We discussed it. "Paul, we're okay here. Both of these new officers," we had gotten another, "know their stuff. They've coped with all the hell of the past 2 nights. I doubt the Japanese will hit this hill again tonight, but they'll sure try to retake that north one if we grab it. All the approaches to it are gradual, much easier for the Japanese." He said, "I'll take my platoon up on the west side. You'll be able to see us all the way to give covering fire. Can you have the mortar men from Company H register just beyond, on the back slope, so I can call them if necessary? About noon, the first platoon passed down the backside of our hill and crossed the ravine to begin their climb up to the Japanese. We began a massive covering fire as they neared the crest. The din of our firing ruled out any sounds of shooting by Clemens's men. As they topped the hill, I watched the men scatter, knowing they were firing and being fired upon. I watched one of our men drop, then the men who were now spread over the entire hill disappeared into existing cover. No Japanese escaped, all were killed. Paul called on the 300 radio. We cleaned it up but lost a man. They were deeply dug in and had rocks piled around their positions. I'm going to set up a defence mainly toward the north and east. I spoke with our new officers. I'm going over to spend the night with the 1st platoon later this afternoon. You've got plenty of men to hold this hill. I doubt they'll hit you tonight. They've been burned plenty. But I'm sure they'll hit the other hill since they'll know Clemens has few men. Our company was now down to less than half strength. If the worst comes, I can direct mortar fire from Company H myself. If you see our machine guns fire, it means they are pressing us hard. I want you to follow the tracer fire from our gun muzzles, then spray as close as you dare in front of them. Understood? These were replacement officers. I knew nothing of their previous experience, but they were gutsy and capable. I noted them checking their men, cajoling them to improve their positions to avoid thrown grenades, yet there was no bullying. I also knew the men in their platoons. There was no give in them. With disgust, I noted piles of worthless grenades lying about. The men had poured the EC blank powder from 2 grenades into one, discarding the empties. At least with a double charge of powder, they wouldn't just break in half. Our front area to the east was littered with large chunks of grenades. Good grenades probably would have broken the Japanese attacks sooner, saving us many men killed and wounded. We were grateful to the carrying party who had come up to help with our casualties. They brought food, water, ammo, and many more cases of those almost worthless grenades. I moved to Clemens's Hill shortly before dark. We set pull-type igniters on the east side of the hill along a main trail that led up from a ravine. At dark, our other hill was hit briefly, but that attack was quickly beaten off. When the attack on our hill came, it was just close rifle fire. No grenades came in. At this time, the enemy must have been short of grenades, for many had been used in the attacks of the prior nights. It was obvious the enemy had crawled up within a few feet of our positions before firing. Even our grenade throwing failed to discourage them. They had a distinct advantage as there was a hair of light in the sky. We became outlined if we moved. I called the Company H mortars in close, but even that failed to dislodge these determined Japanese. Finally, I brought them in so close that the exploding shells flashed in the darkness. They struck close enough that the shrapnel flew everywhere. We had to keep still. The human eye is good at detecting movement. After nearly 2 hours, I'd had enough. I told our machine gunners to open fire. Those guns from our high hill sprayed down around us, just to our front. The covering fire made all the difference. We heard one of our booby traps go off on the trail leading down the hill, then the shout of a Japanese. He was evidently giving a command, calling off his men. All firing ceased. Still, we had lost another man and had several wounded. A fixed location is always vulnerable. The following afternoon, the men wanted to know how close our mortar shells were to us, so I asked Company H for a smoke round. It landed just 15 feet from our line. The men just shook their heads, shocked. The accuracy of the sustained fire from Company H was fantastic, all done in total darkness. Kingston had trained them well. He was an exceptional officer. Competence in combat comes primarily from training and experience. But personal experience is the great teacher. You can learn so much from books, but a practical application of that knowledge is absolutely essential. I realized that we men, even with our 2 years of combat experience, still had lots to learn. We had scored highly in deep jungle fighting, but this mountainous terrain and sometimes semi-open hills brought problems we had never anticipated. Mortar and artillery fire seemed the answer. Close-in aircraft support would have been useful, but we had none. Toward evening, a carrying party came up with supplies. They were Filipinos, accompanied by a few infantrymen for protection. These natives gathered together like a clan, difficult to disperse. I warned them as they were gathering immediately behind me, farther up the ridge. "Get those men spread out. They're going to draw fire." I had another problem. One of our 300 radios would receive but not transmit. The other would only transmit. I had removed the covers from each radio, prior advice by the communications men, to look for those peanut tubes that weren't lighting up. Each radio had at least 12 to 16 small radio tubes, about 5/8 of an inch by 2.5 inches long. The incessant talk behind me forced me to lean forward amid the boulders to blanket out their conversations. At that moment, the ration box in front of me disappeared amid the snapping bullets of a Nambu. The gun was firing from the east hill, about 400 yards away. One of my men behind me, Sergeant Peterson, who had been lying on his stomach, caught a bullet through both cheeks of his buttocks. My timing had been perfect. One bullet had pierced my cap in the centre top as I leaned forward to blanket out the noise. If those men hadn't been so loud, I would have bought some real estate. Wiggling the radio tubes in their sockets did the job. Both were again working. Moisture must have corroded the contacts a bit. We resumed firing that evening, for we could see the smoke of many fires a mile or more to the north. Shortly before dark, I received a message to bring the company back off the hill. We were to be relieved by a unit yet unnamed. As no unit was present to take over immediately, I knew the Japanese would move back the instant we left. What a waste of lives. Poor planning, no coordination. I sent men to locate a safe place for a night bivouac. They returned at dark, so we slipped off down the mountain to a level spot in dense jungle. We set up a tight perimeter for the night, with fewer than normal guards. When morning came, we moved farther to the north, to again climb back up into the mountains. This new climb was up a semi-bare ridge with a bald spot at the top. Beyond that were even higher mountain ridges. Support units of our 2nd Battalion were moving in behind us, locating along the coast. We reached the bald spot at the peak of this lower mountain by 1 p.m. The remainder of Easy was strewn back down the ridge for perhaps 400 yards. To our left front, just below us, was a Nipa hut with enemy activity. With about 6 to 8 men, I dropped down the ridge to a gully that approached the hut. The lead man turned to me, signalling silently that a Japanese was just ahead. I crawled up beside him, hidden by the base of a tree. As I slowly peeked around the trunk, the Japanese soldier did the same, peeking toward me from another tree only 30 feet away. I froze in shock, then realized he didn't see me. He was looking up at the bald spot on the hill. We were below him, bunched, suckers for a single Japanese grenade. I moved my head back so slowly he didn't notice, at the same time motioning for us to get the hell out of there. We would take care of him with mortar fire after regaining our hill. Because our 60 mm mortars were not set up, I called downhill and contacted Captain John Landeck. He told me Company G mortars were ready to fire. I told him the problem, asking if he could see us on the bald spot. "Sure, I see you. Tell me what you want." "We look to be about 900 yards from you. Set a mortar to fire 1,300 yards for one shot. I'll bring it in from there." Only 3 of us were on the peak, a sergeant from Company H, Lieutenant Clemens, and myself. Minutes passed. Finally the mortar popped, and seconds later we realized the shell was coming down on top of us. The 3 of us lay tight, side by side, Paul in the middle, sandwiched by the H-man on one side and me on the other. I heard the hiss of the descending round, but never heard the explosion. I woke up some distance down the hill. Later, a man told me I flew through the air like a rag doll. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds before I regained consciousness. I lay on my stomach, facing up the hill. I could see no men, but a liquid was shooting in an arc across about a 4-foot span. As I watched the pulses, the arc became shorter and shorter. I finally realized it was blood pumping from a large severed artery. I felt no pain, but my legs refused to work. Crawling with my hands and elbows upward about 50 feet, I found our artillery forward observer valiantly trying to stem the flow of blood from the Company H-man's torso. Paul Clemens lay on his back, his jacket front gone, Several chunks of material were embedded in his chest. Almost in a dream, I began to pick pieces of stone and shrapnel out of his flesh. I remember saying, "Poor Paul is dead. Poor Paul is dead." After a moment of dry heaves, I got John Landeck on the radio and told him what had happened. He had witnessed the shell striking us and had been checking. The Company G mortarman was to have set the mortar at 67 degrees. Instead, he had mistakenly set it for 76 degrees, causing a 300-yard short. This error should not have happened. A repeat order should always be given when firing a mortar. The mortar gunner should have called back the setting after he made it. Within minutes, my legs mysteriously began to work again. I had feared a spinal injury from the shell, but the men checked me and found no blood, only bad scrapes and bruises. It wasn't until 1954 that my body finally rejected a piece of cast iron from my rear. All those years I thought it just a big sebaceous cyst. By the time we had things straightened out and the casualties removed, a man came up to me from below. He said, "Captain, down to our right, about 300 yards back, we saw Japanese. They disappeared. We figure they have a cave there." 3rd Platoon of Easy was already involved. Some men had descended part-way down the hill and discovered the cave. They were covering the entrance from 2 sides. Before I arrived, they had thrown an HC smoke grenade inside, then followed it with hand grenades. 2 aggressive men had crawled inside to inspect the damage. The Japanese, still alive, tossed a grenade, wounding both men. One was a young Jewish boy, Airman, whose parents had been lucky enough to ship him from Germany in 1939. I believe they died in a concentration camp. He was clutching a Japanese officer's sabre when he crawled out, not parting with it as he was loaded onto a litter. He was fearless, a bit over 5 feet, no doubt the smallest and lightest man in the company. The officer wounded with him was one of our recent field replacements. I called downhill for explosives and a flashlight, finally getting 4 Bangalore torpedoes and a single detonating cap with fuse. The medic sent up a 3-cell flashlight, the batteries of which were nearly shot. Sergeant Joel Fedye and I slipped down under covering fire to drop 2 of the Bangalores into the cave entrance. We took cover about 70 feet up the hill. Nothing happened. The darn thing failed to explode. That left us in a quandary, for we had no detonator cap for the last 2 torpedoes. Since this was rock country, I had not carried my usual block of TNT with detonator. I suddenly remembered the Bangalores were filled with Amital, not TNT, requiring only a number 6 detonator cap. Removing the top of a white phosphorus grenade, I cut off the cap with my knife and bit it to a fuse. The 2 of us again made our way down to drop the 2 explosive tubes on top of the first pair. Scurrying up the hill, I said to Joel, "We'd better get further away this time. If it goes off, there will be one hell of a bang." The explosion was massive. Descending to the cave, I took the flashlight to crawl inside. There was still so much smoke that I could see nothing, just feel bodies as I crawled over them. Back in the recesses, I heard a man breathing heavily, as if he had asthma. I froze, then backed out, knowing there were Japanese still alive. We booby-trapped the outside of the cave before dark, and were rewarded at about 11 p.m. when we heard the grenade explode. In the morning, I again crawled into the cave. It was now clear of smoke. There, up high, behind a massive rock, a Japanese held a pistol pointed straight at me, his hands resting on the boulder. It didn't seem right that he was alive, as there were dead enemies everywhere. I moved the flashlight to the side, realizing his gun didn't follow the light. Evidently the concussion had killed him. He was locked with both hands on the pistol, prepared to fire at anyone entering the cave. There were 14 bodies in the main part of the cave, nearly all officers, but I didn't check the recesses that led deeper. Evidently the cave had been used as some sort of command post. I gathered up 2 sabres and the pistol and went outside. It was then I realized I was loaded with the biggest, largest cooties that ever existed. They could have been bedbugs. I shed my clothes and shook them out vigorously. Those Japanese inside were infested. I almost forgot to mention the huge brass bed in the cave. They were in great demand after the war. I often wondered how and where they'd got it. That evening, a few of us climbed down from the cave to the ravine below. At the bottom were boulders the size of automobiles. It was dusk, and just as we were going to climb back up the ridge, someone said, "Look up there!" To the east, about 250 yards away, was another ridge, much higher above us. It ran across our front. It was razor-backed with almost vertical sides. An aircraft had evidently dropped a bomb on it some days ago. The cleft from the bomb was about 45 feet wide and 10 feet deep. A column of Japanese were attempting to negotiate this cleft, one by one. 2 of us had scope rifles, only 3 power weavers, but it brought them within 250 feet of us. Although it was near dark, they were illuminated in the fading light. When I emptied one clip, the other M1 began to fire. It was a soldier's dream. They just kept coming and coming, clambering down into the cleft, running across and attempting to climb back up to the trail. I wondered at the stupidity of the Japanese. Why did they persist? Why not wait a few minutes for complete darkness? It was beyond belief. There had to be someone pushing them. Army troops, no doubt. We each emptied about 4 clips, 64 rounds, before it became too dark to see. It was dirty work, but necessary. Judas! There were sure a lot of Japanese around us. The next evening, we were still high in the mountains overlooking the ocean. That evening, we were treated to a show between a PT boat and a persistent Japanese aircraft. The Japanese had been sneaking across from this northern tip of Leyte to Cebu Island, only a few miles to our west. PT boats were endeavouring to stop this traffic, while Japanese aircraft were trying to eliminate them. This particular PT boat had a 40 mm gun aft, tracking the Japanese pilot as he circled to drop his bomb. He was cautious, as the PT boat anticipated his every move, always keeping the stern gun available. After a long period of cat and mouse, the pilot evidently thought enough was enough. He dove at the PT boat and released his only bomb. It was a standoff, since both the bomb and the 40 mm gun missed their targets. The Japanese pilot scooted for home. When darkness fell, we became aware of signal lights flashing from the island of Cebu to the enemy in our vicinity. They blinked intermittently, probably indicating small boats and bankas, native canoes, available for travel that night. One evening, while on the move, we contacted Clayton Kingston's group. They had taken a prisoner. I approached the man, who wore no insignia. He was elderly and thin, wearing a noose around his neck for control. His lack of insignia caught my attention. He didn't look like a common soldier, more like a high-ranking officer. I handed him a Camel cigarette and took one myself. Before I could offer him a light, he held the cigarette up to the twilight to examine it. He smiled and said, "It's a Camel. I used to smoke Luckies before the war." I lit his smoke, amused. He was no common enlisted man. He spoke perfect English with no foreign accent. I would have conversed with him further, but Kingston's men were moving out. A final fight was in the making on a ridge near the ocean. We became embroiled in another 3-day ordeal, losing more men. At this point, I was surprised to receive 9 replacements at noon on the second day. Just as they arrived, one of my men was being carried out. I pointed to him. "Don't stick your heads up looking for Japanese. Look from concealment, not from the top of a rock. That man became careless." One of the new replacements, Bill Kiker, later wrote to me, "From the 4th Replacement Depot in Tacloban, Leyte, Philippine Islands, a bunch of scared, green young infantry replacements boarded a barge on the other side of the island for a much shorter ride to an encampment on the beach behind which rose mountain after mountain." We arrived at 2nd Battalion headquarters of the 164th Regiment, to which all had just been assigned. The 164th Infantry Regiment was part of the Americal Division. Those of us in basic training in Camp Roberts, California, knew the Americal to be one of the premier infantry divisions in the South Pacific. We had been told that Americal units were involved in mopping up operations in this area, Ormoc, Palompon, Abidjao. The time was early, 1945. The next morning, with a couple of non-coms and a carrying party, we set out for our individual assignments. Several of us were to go to Company E, and others to companies along the way. In the afternoon, the going became very hard, all of us covered with sweat, the temperature nearly 110 degrees. One of our group was very heavy and having a difficult time climbing the hills. After falling several times, he declared he could go no farther and for us to leave him there. The non-com leading us came back to talk to him. He told him that if we left him, he would not survive the night. He began to whimper and cry. Private Kingery and I decided that we would see that he got to his assigned unit. I took his M1 rifle and bandolier of ammo, and Kingery took his web belt and pack. We got him standing up, and with each of us on either side, we got him back on the trail. About a half-mile further, we handed him off to the first sergeant of the unit he was assigned to. Others in our column made it to their units, and finally it was just the balance left that was assigned to Company E. Their command post was on a hill presided over by a first sergeant, giving someone hell about using Filipino carrying parties to carry their packs to the hill at the front and to where I finally ended up. A short time later, the CO of Company E, Captain Walker, arrived and began to brief us. The first thing that I recall him saying was that if any of us were wounded, every effort would be made to get to us. He told us one of his NCOs had just been wounded. Moments later, he was informed that the man had died. When we finally made it to the next hill, where the rest of Company E was dug in, it was just before dusk. Since there was not time for me to dig in, I was placed in a slit trench with a barman and another rifleman. I was told that we were covering the flank side of the hill. About that time, the Japanese launched an attack on the forward slope of the hill. The attack was repulsed, but there were casualties. I continued to observe the bottom of the side of the hill where we were located after the attack. The two guys with me correctly guessed that I was a green, scared replacement and not likely to fall asleep on guard. Soon they were totally out. There was still some light and a moon when I noticed 3 figures moving along the bottom of the hill. I decided to go ahead and open fire. I took a sight picture on the lead figure. They were about 40 or 50 yards from our position, lead the figure just a tiny bit, when I opened fire. I then fast-fired the clip at the other 2 figures who had hit the ground. I could have possibly hit the lead man because I saw him kind of tumble. I saw no movement after that. The firing woke up the barman and the other guy. A non-com slid down on our position and asked what we were shooting at. He told us to stay alert, as there could be an attack on our side of the hill. He then told the barman to lay down some fire all along the bottom of the hill if there was movement. The next morning I watched as 3 or 4 dead were being wrapped in their shelter halves to be taken down to battalion by the carrying party that was being assembled. That was my first night day in combat. I was still scared, but no longer green. Near dark on the 3rd night, I received a call from the regimental commander, Colonel Mahoney. "Can you hold that hill another night?" I said. "It's dark now, too late to pack out. There's only one problem. I'm the only officer left. I have sergeants running all 4 platoons. Give me 2 names. They'll be second lieutenants in the morning." I looked at my top choice, First Sergeant Joel Fedji. He had heard the conversation on the radio. He shook his head. "I have enough trouble taking care of the men. I don't want to be an officer." I had several excellent men in mind, but the first 2 names that came to me were Gordon Lindvig and Claire Tongan. I named them. At 7 a.m. the next morning, I was informed they were indeed officers. We were ordered off the hill to move back to Abidjan for transport by water to Ormoc. On the way, one of my non-coms was unable to rise after a short rest on the trail. Nathan Somberg, our battalion surgeon, who was nearby, administered a unit of plasma to him. It was like a miracle. The man got up and made it to the boats. LCVPs transported us to the Ormoc Pier, a cement structure that extended about 400 yards out into the ocean. The concrete deck had massive bomb holes we had to carefully skirt. Our first stop was at a level area where the road came into town from the east. Here, our remaining 64 men of the original 187 of Easy Company received a number of replacements. Many were our wounded just released from the hospital. Others were men who had transferred to other units. They had one thing in common. All held infantrymen qualifications. We also picked up 2 more replacement officers, both of whom were well qualified. While tenting in this area, Filipino women came through camp to pick up laundry. It was delivered the very next day, clean and spotless. One of the girls was beautiful but seemingly bashful. The men looked forward to seeing her each morning. 2 of our men came to me with disturbing news. They had checked with the temporary hospital in Ormoc, also at Graves Registration. They'd found no record of their buddy Paul Barnes being at either. A day later, they again came to me. They had found him buried in the Filipino cemetery. He had died, and his body had been left on the Ormoc pier. Graves Registration had not picked him up, so some kind Filipinos had moved him to their cemetery for burial. They had hung one of his dog tags on a homemade cross. I wasn't happy with our burial facilities and told Graves Registration so. They just shrugged their shoulders, but Barnes was moved. Our next stop was at an abandoned former Filipino army barrack, much in need of repair from strafing and shell damage. Here we worked over our equipment, readying it for our future move to Cebu Island. In the city proper, the main street had been cleared as a landing strip to be used by light aircraft, such as Stinsons and Pipers. To one side of the street, there was an iron-barred open cage holding Japanese collaborators. All females had shorn heads. They sat in the centre of the 20 by 30-foot open cell, attempting to avoid urinating by the spectators, who mocked them from the outside edges of the enclosure. 2 Filipino guerrillas seemed to be in charge. They did nothing to discourage the shenanigans. It was an abhorrent and degrading spectacle, people acting like animals. Still, knowing the atrocities the Japanese had heaped upon these people, I hardened myself to the excesses. Since we would be in Ormoc a few more days, I decided to visit our wounded across the island at the Tacloban Hospital. Leaving early the next morning, my driver, Brading, and I found the roads dusty, with heavy traffic. We arrived at the hospital about 3 p.m. to find a tent encampment, certainly not the best. We were lucky that day, for a truck convoy carrying supplies to Ormoc was ambushed by the Japanese. Only 1 driver survived. I found Pete Sherrar first. He was in a tent ward with several of our wounded from Easy. As soon as he saw me, he called, "Hand me that Japanese sabre under my bed. I want to cut down these damned ropes holding up my leg." He was in traction, grinning as usual, so I knew he was kidding. He confided, "My platoon sergeant, Christiansen, died yesterday morning. He developed peritonitis. The bullet through his hip was responsible. He was in a cast and the pressure on his stomach was too much. He begged me to tear out some of the plaster cast to allow expansion. I did that." Pete looked grim. "Would you believe the doctors and nurses held a dance night before last, leaving only 1 nurse on duty? She was too afraid to remove part of the cast to relieve Chris, so I took it upon myself. These hospital people should be shot. A dance is more important than all of these wounded men." Brading and I visited several of our wounded, some of whom would be going back to duty. Others, more seriously wounded, would be returned stateside. I spoke with a soldier who told me of a transient camp located a few miles to the south, near Dulag. Since dusk was rapidly approaching, we drove there. We found ourselves next to a camp for women who had been released from Japanese prison encampments. Most were carrying and tending to their half-Japanese children. Some of the women even had 2. They were tough. They had to have been to stay alive. Early the next morning, we left for our return to Ormoc to hear the 182nd Infantry had made an assault landing at Cebu City on the island of Cebu. That island was in sight to our west. They had run into a wild fight with mines in the water and a well-organized defense. Still, they had taken the city of 80,000 inhabitants. A patrol torpedo boat group arrived in Ormoc, and we struck up a trade. A Japanese officer's sabre gained us a 100-pound sack of sugar. Sugar had been in short supply, but the Navy, as usual, seemed to have plenty. Incidentally, those swords sold readily to naval personnel for $100 or more at the time. Many men scored cash sales. Fortunately, we had a few spares for trading at the Easy Supply Room. I found Lieutenant Milt Shedd had an exciting experience with the PT boats worth relating. Following is his experience as a crewman. On March 25, 1945, I received permission to accompany 2 PT boats at Ormoc on an attack on Japanese shipping at the island of Cebu. We departed at 17 o'clock with the expectation of returning the next morning at 8 o'clock. We were to create a diversionary attack on 2 coastal vessels in coordination with 20 bombers who were to destroy the Japanese ships. Shortly after dawn, we roared in, creating big rooster tails toward the vessels, while the bombers began strafing and skip bombing. One of our aircraft began smoking and crashed in the vicinity of Mactan Island. Turning both boat sterns to the shore, we took 5 enemy barges under fire as the 2 coastal freighters began to burn. The 5 barges burst into flames as we poured 40 mm and machine gun fire into them. We laid hove to in the water meanwhile. Unfortunately, we were in shoal water with large coral heads, the recoil of our 40 mm gun constantly driving us further into the coral. Attempting to get out, we found ourselves firmly aground. Our companion boat pulled up on the other side of the reef and attempted to pull us clear, but plainly it was impossible. They would have to come inside the reef to assist us. Meanwhile, as we were only 600 yards from shore, the Japanese began to riddle us with rifle and machine gun fire. Several of our crew were wounded as we continued to defend ourselves with the 40 mm and machine guns. A headquarters supply sergeant from the 164th, who had accompanied me, took over as gun loader on the 40 mm because of the wounded. He was inexperienced at the gun, losing a thumb. 3 P-61 night fighters arrived to strafe the shore facilities, easing things somewhat until they ran out of ammunition. Firing our last 40 mm rounds, we found we had over 100 Japanese bullet holes in our craft and many wounded. In the event we had to abandon the boat, we were prepared to swim beyond the reef to the other PT boat. Finally, the other PT boat, realizing our peril, came inside the reef and managed to pull us off. We ended up with 50% of the men wounded and 2 killed. We were under constant fire for over an hour, a sitting duck. Our propellers were badly damaged by the coral, and we could only make 5 knots speed, but the skipper, although wounded, determined to rescue the downed aircraft crew if possible. We slowly cruised up to Mactan Island to the wreck, and saw a young Filipino boy swimming out to us. He spoke English and told us there were no survivors in the aircraft, and that the beach behind the mangroves was loaded with enemy. By this time it was somewhat after the noon hour. We began the long cruise back to Ormoc, but because of our very slow speed, we arrived there the next day at daybreak. Milt's remarks about the guerrillas: "We can't hope to kill all the enemy. Our objective is to disorganize them and scatter them into the hills where they have no supplies stored. They will cease to be any sort of menace, as the guerrillas can take care of them. That is, if the ratio is 25 guerrillas to each enemy, and the enemy are unarmed and in groups of not over 2 or 3. In general, the guerrillas are not even an excuse for fighting men. In some instances they have helped, but the propaganda one hears concerning their prowess is nauseating to a man that has worked with them, and I have worked with them." After a few days' rest at Ormoc, we loaded our equipment onto LSTs, making the brief trip across to Cebu City. Here we bivouacked along the main highway, south of the town. The next 4 days were spent writing 17 letters of condolence to the families of easy men who had been killed on Leyte. This was the hardest task I had ever undertaken. I was familiar with the men's names, but knew little of their hopes and aspirations, little or nothing of their families. I consulted with their friends in the platoon, gaining considerable knowledge and understanding. Thankfully, regimental headquarters did the final typing, correcting my composition. Even with our replacements, the company was nowhere near full strength. Our only consolation: we had eliminated over 360 enemy on Leyte. We knew there were many more from our mortar and artillery fire. The next day, we loaded into trucks, moving south a few miles to the cement plant below Cebu City. Here we unloaded to begin a trek around to the rear of the city. 3 natives met us, travelling in the opposite direction. I began to laugh as I recognized my old company commander. "John, what in heck are you doing dressed in those Filipino clothes? Where have you been?" Gossett had a wry grin. "I've been a spy travelling with these 2 guides. I'll sure be glad to shed these itchy, grubby clothes. The thin Gossett, with his deep, dark tan, did look like a Filipino. Borrowed clothing, crudely woven from flax straw, was indeed itchy. "What did you find?" "Chuck, the Japanese are up on the mountain ridge behind the city. They are dug in with mutually defensive positions. You'll have a tough climb and a tougher fight, since they can see you all the way. It won't be easy to dig them out. I suspect it will also be costly." We continued up the valley, headed north now, all the while watching the ridge to our right. Twice I saw Japanese standing on peaks, peering down at us, the range about 2,000 yards. I was surprised we didn't receive mortar fire from them. When we finally stopped, we were assigned positions for the uphill assault. Meanwhile, a 105 mm self-propelled gun took the hill in Company G's sector under fire. Enemy could be seen moving around on the crest. Few shells exploded. Most ricocheted off the top of the hill. We received a message that the Japanese were shelling the airfield at Cebu City. The airport was closed. Hell's bells. It was discovered that our own self-propelled gun was responsible. For the immediate attack upon the hill, Company F was on the left flank, Easy in the centre, with Company G on the right. We later found the section of ridge assigned to Easy had no Japanese defenders, but every inch was covered by frontal and flanking fire from a distance. I had Gordon Lindvig, one of our 2 direct appointment officers, place his 60 mm mortars on a level spot in defilade, partway up the ridge. A sound-powered telephone line was laid as we advanced. As we reached our objective, we came under heavy rifle fire from, of all places, the high hill in front of Company G. The crest of this hill was perhaps 100 feet higher than our position, and was littered with hundreds of round stones, almost the exact size of a military helmet. I judged the range to the top of this hill to be about 300 yards. Evidently the Japanese had a scope-equipped rifle, or else someone up there was a crack shot. They were that good, for in a matter of minutes several of my men were wounded or killed. I ran to the man holding the spool of wire that led back to our mortars. Hooking up the sound-powered phone he carried, I called for mortar fire on the top of the hill to Company G's front. At that moment someone shouted, "Blackwell's been hit!" Handing the phone to Lindvig, our new lieutenant, I said, "Get the mortars firing on that hill, or we're going to lose a lot of men." Running the 40 or 50 feet to Private Blackwell, I dropped to his side and noted blood coming from his left ankle. That shouldn't have stopped him, so I rolled his head to the side. He was dead. Rising, I ran back to Lindvig. At that instant a bullet struck him in the chest. He held out his left wrist to me as I supported him. He said, "Take my watch, I won't need it any more." He was gone. He had taken a bullet meant for me. Our mortar shells crashed down on that pile of boulders at that instant, stopping further rifle fire from the hill. By keeping up a steady mortar barrage, we were able to dig in, to some extent. Because we were on the peak of the ridge, we dug into the back slope, under the top edge. An hour or so later, I received a call from the battalion commander, Mac. He said, "Chuck, have you room for me up there? I'm coming up to join you." I said, "Sure, but bring a pick mattock. I've started a hole in the shale, but it needs a lot more work." I was to find out later that he had been admonished by the regimental commander, ordered to get the hell up where the men were fighting. Since we had to work closely together now, I mentally declared a truce. When he arrived, I put him to work. He didn't complain as we took turns tunneling into the top edge of the shale rock, making a final hole about 8 feet deep into the ridge. There was a clump of grass growing about 3 feet high just above my position. I added to it each night, using brush and small branches, being careful not to overdo it. Mac had brought up a spotting scope that was worth its weight in gold. While on Bougainville, I had written the Adjutant General of North Dakota, begging him to send us the spotting scopes owned by the National Guard. They were used yearly at the Camp Perry matches held in Ohio. I'd shot on the National Guard team in 1940, so I knew of the scopes. At that time, the National Guard had at least a dozen on hand. With a nasty war going on, that Adjutant General wrote me a surly letter saying, "The spotting scopes are the property of the state of North Dakota. They will not be sent to the 164th Infantry." I wanted to find that stupid ass after the war, but the years healed my temper. That first evening, the Japanese dropped a few mortar rounds on us, probably to register. Early the next morning, I received a call to send down a man to guide 5 replacements up to our company. They had reached the halfway point on their return when the Japanese lobbed mortar shells over our ridge. I watched the impacts down below. One shell landed perfectly upon the 6 climbing men. Stupidly, they were bunched up. All were killed or seriously wounded. There was no doubt in my mind. A Japanese soldier on that high hill in front of Company G was directing the fire. Shortly after 2 p.m. the next afternoon, Company G made an assault upon the high ridge without asking for our support. We could have helped immensely, and did to a certain extent, but it caught us by surprise. I watched Company G men get very near the top of the hill, then stopped by Japanese rising up to throw grenades down upon them. If we had been warned, we could have cut down those enemy soldiers with machine gun fire. Someone had screwed up. There'd been no coordination. Company G men could have taken that hill and saved us all a lot of grief. When darkness fell that night, we were subjected to severe mortar shelling. One mortar shell landed directly over my hole. Mac and I were protected by 3 feet of solid shale, but the explosion stunned us both. I got a call from Company F requesting medical men. Their command post had been hit hard, with several men killed or wounded, not having dug in as securely as we. Their captain, John Landeck, was killed in this mortar barrage. It lasted for about 10 minutes. I guessed perhaps 100 or more rounds came in. We spent the rest of the night solving our problems. A Lieutenant Campbell was now running Company F. I managed to get a .50 caliber machine gun sent up with a panoramic sight. Concealing it in the grass, I sighted it about 1,500 yards to the right front, where I had seen Japanese moving between positions. That evening we began receiving grenade launcher shells, nothing like the 81 mm or 90 mm Japanese shells. Sighting through the panoramic, we saw 2 Japanese. It was obvious one was teaching the other how to fire the grenade launcher. They were in the open, but at a long range. A brief burst from the .50 caliber machine gun changed their minds. Both disappeared. Early the next morning, Mac, who was looking through the spotting scope, said, "Hey, look at this!" I peeked into the telescope to see a pair of Japanese eyes about 50 feet away. He had on a helmet that blended perfectly with the adjoining rocks. I marked his position carefully, looking through my 3-power Weaver scope. He was so small in the glass, I would be lucky to get him. I said, "He's in the shadows now. Let's hope that when the sun swings west this afternoon, he'll still be watching from the same spot." We waited until about 3 p.m., when the sun was in his eyes. Mac spotted him again. "He's there, in the same hole. Think you can get him?" This time I could see his helmet, but not his eyes. Sighting just below the edge of the steel rim, I fired. Lifting my eyes quickly, I saw his helmet tumbling backward up the hill. Mac said, "I think you got him in the forehead. The bullet must have gone through his head, catching his helmet at the rear edge." We studied the hill for the rest of the day, but saw no other Japanese faces. It was about noon the next day when one of my non-coms approached me. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm dripping." Mentally counting back to the time of his infection, I said, "It had to be an Ormoc. Who was it?" "Remember that cute laundry girl?" I certainly did. It was the Beauty. "Who else got to her?" He named 2 men. "Get them." After speaking with them, one man admitted that he too had the clap. The other man was smarter. He had used a condom. I was disgusted and said, "I'm mighty disappointed with both of you. I thought you knew more than that. Get down the hill for your shots, then get back as soon as they turn you loose." Due to the lack of medical facilities and supplies during the Japanese occupation, gonorrhea was almost a sure thing among the prostitutes. That afternoon we were treated to a show. Aircraft bombed the positions just across the valley, on the city-side ridge. The shock waves were spectacular. The air compression from the explosions looked like growing waves of water. We were unable to see any discernible results. Late that afternoon, we were subjected to white phosphorus mortar shells that set the grasses and brush on the back slope of our ridge on fire. There was no danger, but we mulled over the portent of this change. We finally decided the Japanese were pulling out, using the smoke for cover. There was only one way for them to go, north, up the intermediate valley between the two ridges. I didn't think they would get far. Surely the other regiments would have the routes blocked. How they escaped was never explained to us, another cover-up by American Division headquarters. The Japanese were supposedly surrounded. Word came the next morning that indeed the enemy had decamped and that we were to push across the ridges down to Cebu City. After our initial attack upon the mountain, aided by our 60 mm mortars, our 81 mm mortars had taken charge of firing on the local ridge. I had moved our 60 mm's up to the ridge to fire on the opposite ridge overlooking the city. Mac left, accompanied by a few men from battalion headquarters and a Filipino carrier group. The rest of the battalion followed at intervals. I was interested in the Japanese positions straight across from us, so I took a shortcut to them. To my surprise, the Japanese had tunnelled as much as 100 feet or more through solid rock, all below the back slope of their ridge, concealing small holes in the hillside facing us, certainly exhaustive work. These concealed holes provided covering and enfilade fire on our positions. We also found literally hundreds of rounds of mortar ammunition. Why hadn't they used it? Working east, we found a printing press with plates, hastily abandoned, also cases and cases of printed peso bills, occupation money. Everyone grabbed a souvenir handful of this worthless paper. Finally, below us, we spotted the highway leading up to the ridge on the city side. Here we found a multitude of man-made storage caves cut into solid rock. Some even had electric lights. Inside were stored goods from the department stores of the city, all materials looted by the Japanese. Each cave held different items, hardware in some, clothing in others, as well as fuel, and about anything your heart desired. Everything was new, just as it had been taken from the downtown stores. It took only minutes for the men to find new wheelbarrows in which to carry 2 electrical generators, expensive surveying equipment, and other supplies we could use. Some men garnered crated, upright Singer sewing machines to be traded to the Filipino women for favours or money. A woman with a sewing machine was self-made. She was in great demand as a seamstress. I allowed the men to prowl the caves for an hour or so, knowing the entire population of Cebu City would be onto this treasure trove within hours. Before dark, hundreds of civilians were looting. The next afternoon, most everything was gone. At the entrance of one cave, I noted a wide board lying along the narrow entrance. It was 1 by 12 inches and about 12 feet long. It seemed unnecessary to me, out of place. Cautiously, I raised the board on edge to find a tape measure mine where I would have walked. I picked it up and unscrewed the cap, removing the small detonator. I hoped everyone would be careful. They had been warned, again and again. It made sense that the Japanese would booby-trap the caves. Finally, after rounding up the company, we headed back down the mountain. At the bottom, trucks picked us up and transported us to our old bivouac area. Thievery became a problem. The civilians had little or nothing. In one case, a group of Filipino thieves was stealing barracks bags from our supply tents, which were poorly guarded. One of these men was caught in the act at night as he ran with a heavy bag. His mistake was running under a streetlight. His body lay for 3 days in the middle of the intersection. Vehicle traffic was heavy, but all carefully drove around the corpse. It was finally removed on the 3rd night. I anticipated the problem of writing more letters to parents. Fortunately, regimental headquarters was not ready for this necessary paperwork. I received a general order awarding me a 2nd cluster for my Silver Star. My Bronze Star had come after Guadalcanal. Mac picked his new executive officer. Because of his animosity towards me, I wasn't at all surprised that it wasn't me. A few days later, I received an order to report to regimental headquarters. There I saw a grim look on the regimental commander's face. He ordered me to report to Mac as his executive officer. Evidently, Mac had been informed of the situation, and he had gotten his butt chewed. Mac wasn't at all civil to me when I reported to his command post. Looking at me grimly as I walked in, he said, "I guess we'll have to learn to get along together." I replied, "The problem is yours. I've done my best." I knew his resentment was related to the time he had sent me to close the gap at Coley Point on Guadalcanal, and was nearly relieved of his command. He wasn't the bravest man, but we had to get along out of necessity. I was agreeable but wary. A few more days passed, and the battalion troops loaded aboard LCIs, landing craft infantry, for the assault landing at Dumaguete, Negros Island. While still miles away from Dumaguete, we saw the smoke of many fires. The Japanese were burning supplies and part of the town. We landed 6 miles north of the town, with the enemy airfield being 2 miles to our south. Luckily, the airfield had been worked over by our Air Force, as the 12 to 15 aircraft in the parking area had been reduced to junk. We were not bothered by enemy fighters. At the point of our landing, a road ran inland about a half-mile, ending abruptly at a dead end. To clear the beach, I temporarily moved the battalion vehicles onto this short road as they arrived. Mac took the battalion from the end of the road through the jungle, cutting at a 45-degree angle southeast to intersect the road leading from Dumaguete inland to the mountains. A safety perimeter was established around our vehicles and supplies as we awaited further orders. Being the battalion exec, I handled any problems that arose. Around 11 p.m., a firefight erupted. The sound came from the direction the battalion had taken. I guessed the firing was about 6 or 7 miles away. Apprehensive, I called on the radio several times before finally getting an answer. Mac sounded tired and disgusted. He said, "Charlie, you won't believe what just happened. That damned recon group called me on the radio saying they were in Dumaguete and coming out the inland road to join us at our position. I had a battalion perimeter set astride the road with machine guns covering both directions. I guess the men were tired and confused when I told them the recon group would be joining us after dark.